an ultimate global podcast. Hello, and welcome to our special weekly podcast on trending international and social affairs. You're listening to Saurabh Kora and George Mavros from Sydney.
Good evening to everyone who is joining us from Sydney and also from around the world for this wonderful podcast of Ultimate Global Podcast. And today we are discussing about a topic which is definitely not only popular in the Nordic, but it's talked about around the world, that why Scandinavian countries are considered to be the happiest in the world. What's the reason behind that? Is it the better quality of life? Or is it because that they have less political issues, less geopolitical issues? Or is it because that there is something in the way they live, in their culture, that makes them happier than other countries? Now, to discuss this, we have got the business development or sales specialist from Leadfeeder. His name is Karan Khosla, and he has been born and brought up in Denmark, one of the Nordic countries. So, welcome to today's podcast, Karan.
Thank you.
And I would be looking forward to hearing some insights from you on this topic. Just to provide you an insight, and just for the reference of my audience, that even I have stayed in Finland 3 years back on a 5-month student exchange program. So I'm looking forward to this discussion where both of us can bring some insights to this topic. So first of all, Karan, I want to know from you your general views, because you have been born and brought up in Denmark. What do you feel is the real reason that the Scandinavian countries always rank in the top 3 or 4 countries as the happiest countries in the world?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a question where you also have to sometimes take into consideration like the sort of the negative sides or the things that are not talked about. So if I can start answering your question by focusing on the positives. So I think there's a lot of social equality. So there's not too many of the uber rich and powerful at the very top, and then very, very poor people at the bottom. There's sort of a social cohesion, which is very good in the middle. And because of this social equality also allows for some social mobility. So you can change in between the different social classes, which is not really a class defined system in Denmark anyway, but what there is, you can actually move between. And that also leads to a big sense of social responsibility. So, for example, in Denmark, we have a very high tax rate. I think most people are paying around about 45% in tax. And in some other countries, that may not be acceptable, but in Denmark and a lot of the other Scandinavian countries is accepted. And from that, the government is then able to provide a lot of services. So we say we have free healthcare and free university even, and free schooling and a lot of free services. They are paid through the tax system, but they are free in the sense that you don't actually individually have to go and pay anything when you go to the doctor or the hospital or to university, which is a big difference from other countries. And that allows for I think a lot of happiness and a lot of sort of opportunities in society.
I think that's a very valid point, Karan, that you raised. One point is social security. Even when I was in Finland, I saw that this is a common phenomena for the government to provide free education, free health for a person who is coming from an Indian background, where we have never seen such kind of a situation where education is free and health is free, and that is of really good quality. Was a bit surprise for me, because back in our countries, especially in South Asian countries, you have to really struggle a lot to get to a good private school and get that kind of education, especially if you don't have enough funds, and if your parents cannot afford your studies and you are entering into a government school. Definitely government schools in most of the states are not funded, especially except 1 or 2 of the states. Now we see possibly states like Delhi, where a model has been implemented similar to the Scandinavian countries, which has been kind of under controversy as well, because the size of the population is pretty large in India. So implementing a freebie kind of a model in India might not be feasible in the long run, is what is questioned by a lot of people. But then I think the Delhi government has posed their own arguments, where they say that if the corruption is reduced, which is also a major concern, and which is kind of a direct symbol or direct sign of what I see in Finland and Scandinavian countries as well. If you look at the reports, which is the transparency index report or the corruption report,
Yeah,
in that also the least corrupt countries are the Scandinavian countries. So
correct.
that kind of points out to the symbol that if you are able to reduce corruption and spend the taxpayers money in the right direction, you can in fact do a lot of good things, isn't it, Karan?
Yeah, I think so. And Denmark, and I believe your neighboring country, New Zealand, as well. They were ranked number one in the anti-corruption index as well. And I do think that having low levels of corruption, so the money, the tax money, is actually spent on things for the citizens, is a very important aspect in this. And you can add to that in Denmark, you also have a very sort of strong sense of like it is a patriotic society. It is a society that is very proud, and it's also a very homogenous society. So the population size is very small, religiously and ethnically and socially and culturally. It's a very homogenous society, which I think made it easier for the sort of welfare state that we're talking about to emerge. I don't think it's necessarily to have a welfare state, but maybe for the emergence of one, it was very important. And you shouldn't take away from the larger countries, especially countries like India, which have all the potential, but the emergence of a welfare state is going to be much more difficult because you have thousand or millions times more people, in your country, and the population density is also much higher. So it's going to be much, much harder, but hopefully not impossible.
Absolutely. And now also talking about other parameters, Karan, other than the social security and corruption, if you look at the cultural differences between Nordic countries and other countries, one
Mm,
of the major differences which definitely pops up in everyone's mind is that in Nordic countries, you will find people are not focusing on features like competition, which is quite predominant in countries like if you go to United States or you go to United Kingdom. So competition amongst people is quite high. The work-life balance, because of which kind of diminishes, because
yeah,
everybody is trying to compete against each other and they are trying to earn more money. The focus is towards earning more rather than living a better quality of life and that kind of also impacts the happiness, whereas in countries in the Nordic, people are focusing more towards a better quality of life. People say that after 4 or 5, I'll turn off my laptop, sorry, please contact me on Monday. So that's the kind of difference I see. Do you also see that as a major differentiator?
yeah. So we have this law. It's an unwritten law actually in Denmark, a social law, call it that, called Janteloven. And it's sort of a social code that says that nobody should feel like they're better than anybody else. And it's criticized a lot because people says it keeps people down. But from the other side, it's seen as a positive thing because it makes people not so competitive, or people not arrogant is maybe the better word. That nobody, you're not better than somebody else. That we're all sort of part of a whole, and we have to live as sort of this communal spirit. I think sort of, if we also focus on the other side of that, one of the differences between, for example, India and the US, which are, I would say, very, very hyper competitive societies, is the level of entrepreneurship is also higher, I think, in these countries. So yes, we have this benefit of happiness, and I would take that over the other thing. But you also see most of, like, for example, the tech startups and entrepreneurial spirits are not coming from our countries. We do have some, I shouldn't undersell either. We have some very good and global and big companies. For example, what's the big tech startup from Europe? Just Spotify is the biggest one I can think of, and there's not that many other on that level, at least. So I think there's the both sides of the coin when we're talking about being competitive. But yes, definitely, to answer your question, there is a higher sense of don't feel like you're better than somebody else, and we're in this together.
Yep, absolutely. And I think entrepreneurship is something which you have correctly touched based upon. A lot of entrepreneurs, that's why they generally come from India, because
Mm,
they have gone through that rigor, that struggle of, competing against so many people. And when they go abroad to countries like USA, you will see that a lot of people in that Silicon Valley are from the South Asian background, and
mm,
who eventually turn out to be CEOs or CFOs of companies like
yeah.
Google or Microsoft, or
Microsoft.
any of those companies, you will see a lot of Indians, a lot of people from South Asia in that background. Another point that I want to touch base upon, and that is for sure because Karan, you are coming from an international affairs background,
Yeah.
is the geopolitical scenario. Now, I know that in cases of United States has got a lot of geopolitical situations going on in the Middle East, in the South Asia, or even in what's happening now in Russia. Similarly, for countries in Europe, in the Central Europe also, I think there has been some sort of geopolitical scenarios building up. Not now, but because of the situation in the past, we always see some things happening. And even in South Asia, the kind of relationship that is shared between India and Pakistan, or India and Bangladesh, it's known to everyone. What happened after the partition. It's the post effects of the partition are somehow still there
Yeah.
in the South Asian culture as well. But somehow the Nordic countries are staying away from it. We see
Oh,
that they are not much affected by the geopolitical scenario, what's happening around the world. Though recently I've heard that Russia might target as Finland as their next target if they consider to join the NATO. So, what do you think about this geopolitical scenario affecting the
yeah.
happiness of Nordic countries?
So the geopolitical situation of the Nordic countries is interesting because it's a bit different. So Denmark and Norway are in one side, and then Sweden and, for example, Finland in another side, because the policy of Sweden has been one of neutrality. It was a neutral country, for example, during World War II, and is not a member of NATO. And now there's Finland, as far as if my history is correct. And both of these countries are now thinking of joining NATO. The Swedish Prime Minister has been out saying that they will not do that. In Finland, the Finnish president visited Biden in the US, and the sort of common consensus is over 50%. The last polls I read that they want to join NATO. Denmark, however, Danish security has been NATO. So Denmark has been a very active member of NATO during the, for example, Iraq War. It had per capita the same amount of casualties as the US. It was very active in the fighting, and just recently has now increased the spend to 2% of GDP, which is what NATO commits its countries to spend on the military. So Denmark is very geopolitically involved. It just is not directly. It's through NATO and through the US. So it's stayed in sort of geopolitical conflicts through that. However, there has not been geopolitical conflicts in the region. And I think those are due to two reasons. First of all is the EU and sort of the common European framework under it, or the European Economic Area for Norway, has led to a lot of peace. The second thing is the emergence of democracies has meant that there's sort of something called democratic peace theory in international relations, which is that two democracies don't really ever go to war. And if you count Russia as a democracy, I guess they went to war with Ukraine, but I think most people would not. So I think those are sort of the different factors, the European Union and the NATO and the common security alliances, which has meant there hasn't been a geopolitical struggle. Plus, these countries are quite similar. They're quite similar in history. They used to be like India and the surrounding countries in the Indian subcontinent. They were once one country, but there hasn't been these ethnic and religious conflicts which have caused a problem. And then the countries have remained fairly stable democracies, whereas in, for example, the case of Pakistan, they have some problems with the military rule versus the governmental rules versus religious struggles, where India has tried to remain very secular, and now maybe there's an increase in Hindu nationalism. And I won't get into too much of the politics, but I think those are some of the factors which can cause geopolitical struggle or conflict.
Yeah, I think these are really great insights, Karan, that you just shared. I know that we are running short of time and you have got some other stuff as well. But
Sure.
one last question before we end today's podcast will be towards this fact that what can be some of the learnings, some of the top 2 or 3 learnings which other countries can take from Nordic countries in terms
Yeah.
of not mixing religion with politics. I think that's one of the important points. When you try mixing religion and politics and mix it with the geopolitical scenario, it
Yeah.
kind of diminishes the main development concerns, right? Then the politicians or the governments can always win elections over religion, rather than asking for votes in the name of corruption, in the name of
Yeah.
development. Because when you start focusing on corruption, development, that's the time, and social security, that's the time when when you can really focus on main issues, and you can get the people out of poverty. If you can get them educated, you can get them out of poverty, they will themselves find good jobs, isn't it?
Yeah, hopefully, at least that's the hope, right? So that's a very, very difficult question, because and I always try to say this to people, there's two factors to consider here. One is for the social welfare state, one is the emergence of it, and the other one is the maintenance of it, right? So I think what has been the case for Denmark and for many of the sort of the Scandinavian countries is, from a religious perspective, Scandinavia is a Protestant, so it's a Christian Protestant nation. So within Christianity, you have, for example, the Catholics and the Orthodox, and these are what I would say more political and more like stronger religions, whereas Protestants is a little bit more loose. There's an easier way to separate church and state. Max Weber, one of a German sociologist, one of the sort of fathers of sociology, according to some, he sort of wrote about this, that he thought, his theory was that because of the nature of what Protestantism was, that it was going to be more successful than, for example, the Catholic Christians out in the world. So I think in Denmark, what has happened is you've been able to separate church and state. There has not been that much religious competition. So there's been one dominant religion, and that religion itself was not so religious, I would argue. And therefore, church and state were separated, and a secular sort of culture emerged, and that led to a lot of success. And I would say, actually, India should also get more credit than it gets. It's been a fairly secular country for a lot of its history since independence and since Nehru and whatnot. If you look at another country like Turkey, which also with Ataturk had a lot of history of being secular and secularizing, and then now under the latest government has been taking some steps back, you could say. I think India has done fairly well until recently. So it's not easy. It's very, very, very hard to decouple religion. It's very hard in India's case because of the ethnic makeup and how many different religions there are, and especially the two biggest religions in India have had historically some conflicts between them. I would say are very political in nature, the religions themselves, which would cause problems down the road. So what you can do is you can hope that maybe more and more of the population turns atheist, or at least become nominally religious. Nominally means that they are adherents to a religion, but they don't necessarily believe everything within the religion, or that there's some sort of peace that comes between the different religions. And I think your best bet is secularizing, becoming more atheist, and becoming more nominally religious. That's my stance.
Thank you so much, Karan, for sharing your insights. And I think this was a really great discussion to exactly understand and go to the core root of understanding why Scandinavian countries are actually happier than other countries. I'm sure that there might be a lot of other insights when we share this episode with people to understand what they feel. So thank you so much for participating, Karan. I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did.
I did.
This is an ultimate global podcast. Hello, and welcome to our special weekly podcast on trending international and social affairs. You're listening to Saurabh Kora and George Mavros from Sydney.